So, Chapter 22, Energy Balance and Metabolism. We'll talk about energy balance, metabolism, homeostatic control of metabolism, and regulation of body temperature. We're actually going to start off with how the brain controls food intake. So, food intake control is in the hypothalamus. We have a feeding center that's tonically active that makes us hungry, and we have a center that helps us feel satisfied. So, it'll inhibit that feeding center. Now, there are two major theories in how food intake is regulated. The first is the glucostatic theory, and this one has to do with glucose. And it basically says if the hypothalamus, again, this is your feeding center, has a lot of glucose that it's utilizing, then it's going to make you feel full because it has a lot of glucose. It doesn't need you to eat to bring in more. If it doesn't have a lot of glucose, it's not using a lot of glucose, then it's going to make you feel hungry. The lipostatic theory, think of lipids, so fat. So your body's fat cells actually create a chemical that's released into the blood. And depending on how much of that chemical is available in your body, your brain will make you feel hungry or full. So if there isn't a lot, then your brain is going to make you feel hungry because that basically means you don't have a lot of fats. And if there's a lot, then your brain is going to make you feel full. Now, if we look at metabolism, I'm sure a lot of you guys have talked about how you have either fast metabolism or slow. There are certain things that will impact your basal metabolic rate. Some of these factors we can control, others we have no control over. So the first two that's mentioned is your age and your gender. So men have a higher basal metabolic rate than women, mostly because women have more adipose tissue and less lean muscle mass. Age also will cause a decrease in your metabolic rate. So the older you get, you're going to have a slower metabolic rate. So if you are just as active now as you were 10 years ago, you're eating exactly the same, you might find that you're actually starting to gain weight just because your metabolic rate decreases with age. The amount of lean muscle mass also plays a role. So the greater the lean muscle mass, the more you burn. Activity level is another one. So the more active you are, the higher your basal metabolic rate. And your diet. So depending on the types of food that you eat. So your metabolic rate increases after a meal. And fats cause relatively little diet-induced thermogenesis compared to proteins. So eating proteins, you burn more than eating fat. Hormones also play a role. So certain hormones like thyroid hormone, catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, these all speed up your metabolism. And then finally, your genes. You can take a look at your parents, and they may be an indication of what your future may hold. So your genes play a role. Obviously, things like age, gender, your genes, these are things, your hormones that you really can't control, but you can control your activity level. You can control your diet. You can also impact your lean muscle mass, although to be honest, that's quite difficult to do, I have found. Okay, so metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. And we're going to look at metabolic pathways and metabolic states. So anabolic versus catabolic, we talked about this before. Anabolic pathways build up. So think of taking small things and creating something big. Catabolic pathways break down. So you're going to take something big and break it into smaller components. Then we have your metabolic states. You have your fed and your fasted state. Your fed state is after you have fed. So after you've eaten, you're going to have a lot of substances kind of in your blood, okay, floating around. You're going to be basically high in blood glucose. In the fasted state, you have fasted. You haven't eaten for a while. So this is when, for example, your blood glucose is going to be low. So your body's going to need to tap into your stored glucose kind of to keep you going. As a result, when you're in the fed state and your blood glucose is elevated because you've just eaten, then you are going to turn on anabolic pathways. What you're going to do is you're going to take that blood glucose, those little glucose individual molecules, and you're going to store it as glycogen in your liver, in your skeletal muscle. So you're taking small things and creating something big. In the fasted state, because your blood glucose is low, you need to raise your blood glucose. So you're going to turn on catabolic pathways. Here, you're going to take that stored glycogen. Remember, glycogen is just glucose stuck together, and you are going to break it down into the individual components, in this case, glucose, and release that into the blood. And again, that's going to bring homeostatic levels of glucose in your blood. So when we eat, three general categories. You have your fats, your carbohydrates, and your proteins. Let's take a look at their fate. Like, what is it that we do really with proteins? So proteins, if you recall, are made up of your amino acids. So you have a pool of amino acids that you've brought in, and really the main fate, the primary fate of amino acids or proteins is that we use it to make our body's proteins. Remember, those amino acids were attached to tRNAs, and those transfer RNAs bring it to the mRNA, and you create your primary sequence, etc. Then we have your fats. So fats, remember, the most abundant type is your triglyceride, glycerol backbone, 3 fatty acid chains. So we have our free fatty acid pool. The number one fate of fat is we store it. Then we have our carbohydrates. So our glucose, we have our pool of glucose. The number one fate of glucose is we use it to create energy. So our ATP production. So that's going to help give energy to our tissues as well as our brain. Now let's take a look at this pool of glucose. Notice we have a normal range of glucose between these two red lines. If glucose levels start to increase, so we become hyperglycemic, we will start to see glucose in your urine. We also will store glucose in our body as glycogen, and when we need more glucose, we can get it from that store. Notice also the opening for glucose going to the body is higher than the opening for glucose going to the brain. What that basically means is when you become hypoglycemic, your blood glucose levels start to fall, your body will sacrifice using it so that you have it available for your brain. Remember, we talked about this before, your brain uses 50% of your body's glucose. So this kind of summarizes the primary fates, which is the one with the asterisks. And I've just included this here. This should look familiar. This is our aerobic metabolism. Again, just to remind you about what we do with glucose. So we take that glycogen, remember that's just stored glucose, we break it down, we have our glucose, we go through glycolysis, then into the mitochondria, the pyruvates will bind with acetyl-CoA, turn into acetyl-CoA, and then it goes through the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, and we get a bunch of ATP. Okay, back to fat. So here we have our dietary fats. And fat, we're going to learn more about this in the digestive lecture, but they come in the form of big fat droplets inside your intestines. And again, that's because lipids and water don't mix. So the fats are going to kind of form this big fat droplet. We're going to emulsify the fat with the help of bile, which is shown here in green. And we are going to eventually absorb it into our body. And when it comes into our body, we have different types of fat. We have our HDL, we have your LDL. Now, primarily we get LDLs. Our body can actually synthesize HDLs. And the ones that's not good for us are your LDLs. And what you notice over here is we notice that the higher the level of LDL cholesterol, notice your risk for coronary heart disease increases. Okay, so we really want to watch those low-density lipoprotein cholesterols. Now let's go back to our different metabolic states. So we have our fed and our fasted. So to go over again, during our fasted state, our blood glucose is low. What we want to do is we want to raise it back up. So we are going to turn on catabolic pathways. So catabolic pathways are going to break down the glycogen stores in our skeletal muscle, in our liver, and release glucose into the blood. Now, glucose will be used to fuel our body, and in particular, it will be used to fuel our brain. Now, your body can use glucose as well as other things, actually, like free fatty acids for energy. Our brain, however, needs that glucose. If blood glucose is ever too low, then our liver will actually take free fatty acids and create ketones. And our brain could also use ketones. But when we do that, we also have to consider the fact that these are keto acids, so it puts us into acidosis. Now, blood glucose is something we've been talking about. How do we regulate that? Well, hormones play a role, a very important role, particularly hormones released by the pancreas. So the pancreas is quite unique. We have an exocrine and an endocrine part of the pancreas. We're going to start off in this chapter talking about the endocrine part of the pancreas. The endocrine part of the pancreas is going to make hormones. They're going to be made by a group of cells which collectively we call the islets of Langerhans, and they're made up of alpha cells, beta cells, and D cells. I'm going to focus on the alpha and the beta. So the alpha cells secrete glucagon. That's our hormone. Beta cells release insulin and amylin. I'm really just going to focus on insulin. So what does glucagon and insulin do to blood glucose? Well, insulin lowers blood glucose levels. So it takes glucose in the blood and causes you to store it in your tissues. Glucagon does the opposite. It raises blood glucose. So it takes the stored glucose and it causes you to release, or stored glucose as glycogen, and causes you to release it as glucose into the blood. So let's take a look at a typical 24-hour period. So you wake up in the morning. When you wake up in the morning, typically your blood glucose is going to be low because you haven't been eating all night. Then you have your first meal. And when you eat your first meal, your blood glucose starts to rise. And when your blood glucose starts to rise, your beta cells will start to release insulin. Why? Because insulin lowers blood glucose. So it's going to make sure that your blood glucose doesn't rise too much. And when insulin is released, it causes your blood glucose to go back down. And so your insulin secretion goes down. And then it's your next meal. So then blood glucose goes up because you've eaten. Your pancreas releases more insulin. And then blood glucose goes down, insulin levels fall, and then it's your next meal, etc. So you can see over a 24-hour period, we have this constant up and down cycle that happens. Glucagon levels remain relatively steady, and really it's the ratio of insulin and glucagon secretion. So when insulin levels are really high, insulin dominates. When insulin levels fall, glucagon dominates. That's kind of how it works. All right, so to summarize, insulin, it is the dominant hormone in the fed state because it's going to promote anabolism. Insulin secretion is influenced by things like high blood glucose. Since insulin lowers blood glucose levels, obviously you're going to want to release it when glucose is high. So that's going to be a stimuli. Now, insulin doesn't only lower blood glucose. It's not anabolic just for glucose. It's also anabolic for proteins as well. So when your amino acid levels are really high too, it can promote insulin release. It's also released in a feed-forward mechanism. So when you start eating, your body knows you're going to be bringing in glucose, so it'll start to release it. And in times of stress, the sympathetic nervous system can actually stimulate the pancreas to inhibit insulin secretion so that glucose is available in the blood for your body to utilize for energy. Because in emergency situation, you want a lot of glucose available. Glucagon, again, is the opposite hormone. It is dominant in the fasted state. So again, it's antagonistic to insulin. Antagonistic just means it does the opposite. So those are your two major hormones that control blood glucose. Now, how exactly does insulin promote anabolism? Well, insulin, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to start with 3 and 4 actually. So insulin enhances utilization of amino acids. So it causes you to use amino acids. Remember, it doesn't just impact glucose, it can also impact amino acids, as well as fat. So it also can promote fat synthesis. So insulin will lower amino acids and fats in your blood. And we know it also lowers blood glucose. And number 1 and number 2 are related to glucose. So let me read those. It says, insulin will increase glucose transport into most, but not all, insulin-sensitive cells. An insulin-sensitive cell is just a cell that has a receptor for insulin. So when insulin is released, it's basically saying that cells that have the receptor for insulin will start to transport glucose into it. And by doing that, your blood glucose levels fall. It also, number 2, enhances cellular utilization and storage of glucose. So not only does insulin cause cells to bring glucose into the cell from the blood, it also causes that cell to store the glucose as glycogen. So here's an example of that. So here's our cell. Here's our insulin receptor. Glucose is out here in the extracellular fluid. And inside the cell, in this secretory vesicle, we have our GLUT transporter. Remember, GLUT transporters are facilitated diffusers specifically for glucose. When insulin is released, because blood glucose is elevated, insulin binds to the insulin receptor, and we get a signal that causes these vesicles to exocytose. And when they exocytose, the GLUT transporters get inserted into the membrane, and now glucose will diffuse in. Why does it diffuse in? Because it's facilitated diffusion. And facilitated diffusion tells us solids move from high to low concentration. However, they only move from high to low until you reach equilibrium. So that's where number 2 comes in. Number 2 says insulin also causes your cell to store the glucose. So when glucose comes in, if we then store this glucose as glycogen, it's not glucose anymore. So that's going to keep our concentration gradient going so that more glucose is able to come into the cell. And so in that way, blood glucose levels will start to fall. Okay, and that's what we're seeing here. Okay, so glucose comes in, we're going to store it, and we're going to be able to bring in more glucose. All right, in the fasted state, the opposite will happen. Glucose levels will be high inside the cell, and so glucose will diffuse out into the extracellular fluid. So here is a summary that looking at the fed and fasted state and how insulin and glucagon work. So in the fed state, when you've eaten, you have a lot of glucose in the blood, we want to store it. So we're going to stimulate the beta cells to release insulin so that we store glucose, and glucose levels will go back down. Now, once glucose levels start to fall, we always have to have negative feedback. Negative feedback goes back up to the pancreas and says, hey, don't release any more insulin. If you don't have negative feedback, then what will happen is your blood glucose will fall too much. Okay, so you'll go from one extreme to the other. But negative feedback makes sure you stop. In the fasted state, you fasted, your blood glucose is low. So now we need to raise it. So which hormone does that? Are glucagon. So glucagon is released by the alpha cell, and that's going to increase blood glucose. And again, we have negative feedback so that we don't increase it too much and go too far in the opposite direction. So negative feedback is important because what it does is it brings balance to the system. Okay, now a disease related to glucose issues is diabetes mellitus. So it's characterized by an abnormally elevated blood glucose level, so hyperglycemia, that results either from inadequate insulin secretion, abnormal target cell responsiveness, or a combination of both. There are 2 major types of diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. You might have heard of these. So type 1 is where you are insulin deficient. You don't have enough insulin. Why does this happen? Typically, it is an autoimmune disease where your own immune cells start to destroy the beta cells of the pancreas that make insulin. That's why you're insulin deficient. In type 2, you're known as insulin resistant. So in insulin resistant diabetes, your body does not respond to the insulin like it normally should. So insulin levels in type 2 diabetes could be normal. It could actually be elevated initially, but after a while, it can become deficient. Okay, so let me see. So let me talk about type 1 really quickly. So type 1, again, is insulin deficient. And typically with type 1 diabetes, you're diagnosed earlier. This used to be known as the juvenile onset, although now we know a lot of young kids are getting diagnosed with type 2, which is more of a lifestyle diabetes. So let's take a look at why it's so important to control blood glucose. So this is an example of someone who has type 1 diabetes mellitus, so they don't make insulin. They ate a huge meal, their blood glucose became elevated, which is normal if you eat a huge meal. Normally, you should release insulin, but these type 1 diabetics cannot release insulin, so no insulin is released. Now, I'm not going to focus on fat and protein. I'm just going to focus on the glucose. So if no insulin is released, your blood glucose levels are going to be elevated. So you'll have hyperglycemia, high blood glucose. When your blood glucose is elevated, but it's not getting into your cells, okay? So the glucose is high inside your blood, but it's not getting into your cells. Your brain, remember the glucostatic theory that we started off talking about? It said that how much glucose your hypothalamus is using will either make you feel full or hungry. But in this case, the brain isn't getting access to that glucose. So it's going to make you feel hungry. So that leads to polyphagia. Polyphagia is where you eat a lot. Now, if you have a lot of glucose, remember that pool of glucose we talked about earlier? We said if glucose levels get too high, then we start to see it in your urine. So that's what's going to happen. We're going to start to see glucose in your urine. Essentially, glucose is going to be too high for your kidneys to process normally. It'll make more sense, or it'll come up again when we get to the renal lecture. So you'll start to see glucose in your urine, and that's called glucoseuria. Now, we know water follows solutes. Osmosis tells us that. So if there's a lot of glucose, big glucose solutes in your urine, guess who follows? Water. So what does that mean? That means you're going to produce a lot of urine. So it leads to polyuria, lots of urination. Now, if you urinate a lot, you're losing a lot of water, so you become dehydrated. When you become dehydrated, guess what the hypothalamus does? It makes you feel thirsty because you have to replace that water. So that leads to polydipsia. And this one's easy to remember because it's, think of constantly dipping your cup in water. Now, if you become dehydrated, we'll talk about ADH in another chapter as well, but this is your antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Your hypothalamus will promote the secretion of ADH as well, and that is another way for our body to try to retain water. Now, if you become dehydrated, your blood volume is obviously going to decrease because water is carried in blood. If your blood volume goes down, blood pressure goes down. They're directly related, and that can lead to circulatory failure. In addition, your body may utilize anaerobic metabolism to make energy because everything's not working properly. You're not getting blood circulating. You don't have enough oxygen to do aerobic, etc. And when we do anaerobic, remember we make lactic acid, and there's that word acid. It's going to cause metabolic acidosis. Now, when we get to the respiratory chapter, you'll learn about this more, but one way to deal with acids, too much acids in your body, is to increase your ventilation, increase breathing, to try to breathe out CO2. And so that causes hyperventilation. So all of this can kind of cycle, and notice so many organ systems are being impacted just because you had too much glucose. Eventually, it can, if this continues, lead to a coma or even lead to death. Okay, so you can see how serious of a condition this is. Type 2 diabetes, about 90% of diabetics have type 2. So this is the one that's a lot more common. And it's really attributed to lifestyle, specifically the fact that we live a sedentary lifestyle, a huge food supply, and as a country, we really are dealing with being overweight and obese. So here, you recall, we are insulin resistant. And there are complications with type 2 diabetes like atherosclerosis, neurologic changes, renal failure, blindness. Now, how do you want to treat type 2 diabetes? Well, remember, this is a lifestyle disease, so really you want to try to target it with lifestyle therapy. So change your diet, start to exercise, lose weight, and see if that helps. But if it doesn't, you may need to utilize drugs as well. This is an example of a glucose tolerance test, and some of you might have had this done. You will fast overnight, then they will take a sample of your blood to look at your fasting glucose level. Then they'll give you a drink that's kind of high in glucose, and in a normal subject, your blood glucose will be elevated, and then it'll actually go back down within an hour, and by 2 hours, you're back to normal. But if you're diabetic, your body doesn't respond the same way. And as a result, your blood glucose becomes elevated even at fasting. But after that drink, it really becomes elevated, and then it stays elevated because insulin is either not being secreted or insulin does not work. Now, I wrote effects of exercise here in question mark. Guess what? Exercise helps. So exercise not only helps because it's good to prevent diabetes, but it will also cause your body to take up glucose into your skeletal muscles. And that way, you're going to lower blood glucose. So exercise is just great overall. Another thing that you may hear when you're talking about diseases like diabetes is the metabolic syndrome. It's a combination of type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis, and high blood pressure. And people with metabolic syndrome have to meet the 3 of these 5 criteria, and they are central obesity. Central obesity is the weight you carry around your waist, so your waist circumference. So in men, if you're greater than 40 inches, and in women greater than 35 inches, you have one of the criteria. Another is blood pressure. If your blood pressure is greater than or equal to 130/85, fasting blood glucose levels greater than 110 milligrams per deciliter, and elevated fasting plasma triglyceride levels, and also low plasma HDL. Now, HDL is your good cholesterol, the high density lipoprotein. So if you have 3 of those 5 criteria, you'll have the metabolic syndrome. All right, so we're going to end with body temperature regulation. So we need to regulate our body temperature. You can see this nice image showing you all of the different ways we can do that. I want to focus on this figure here. So here we have our thermoreceptors. We have peripheral and central thermoreceptors that kind of keep track of our body temperature. The hypothalamus regulates our body temperature. So it will stimulate the correct response. So if you have an increase in temperature, your hypothalamus will stimulate your sympathetic neurons to cause you to sweat. So when you sweat, you're actually going to lose heat through evaporative cooling. It's also going to cause your cutaneous blood vessels to vasodilate, and that's because heat is carried in blood. So you want to bring the heat up to the surface of the body so that heat can be lost to the environment. So it's going to vasodilate the blood vessels right under your skin. If body temperature is found to be too low, you want to create heat. And so you will do the opposite to those cutaneous blood vessels. You will vasoconstrict them, and that will conserve heat. It will keep heat closer to your vital organs, away from your extremities. And that's why when you're really cold, your fingers and your toes are the ones to get frostbite. You also have something called brown fat. Now it says question mark in humans. It is found in humans. It's found in babies, and some adults have been shown to have brown fat. And basically this is an example of non-shivering thermogenesis. So thermo, heat, genesis, creation. You're going to create heat, but not through shivering. Here you're going to use brown fat. So if you look over here, it's basically the mitochondria uncoupling, so that electron transport chain where you create energy. In this case, you're going to create heat instead. And then finally, you have your skeletal muscles. Obviously, when you're really cold, what do? You shiver. And when you shiver, your muscles contract, and that contraction creates heat. So that's called shivering thermogenesis. So that was chapter 22. Thank you.